another episode of Smash the Bug. I am your host, Joseph, and we joined with another host here today,
Jesse.
It's good to be with you all here. We're going to be talking about some interesting stuff. So make sure you don't just skip it over saying, hey, the two brothers are out talking, so let's just kind of skip over this. This is going to be a good one, so make sure to keep listening. And as I always say, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, SwiftOtter Inc., or to the Smash the Bug podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. And I always do a different order of those every time, but at least I have them memorized by now. So let's jump in, talk about some news. Jesse, what do we got going for news here?
All right, we got Reacticon happening today, depending on your time zone. So it's kind of yesterday, probably in Europe by now. But they talked about some pretty cool stuff, including Alpaca, next version of that coming out or out already. And that is essentially a theme for Magento, kind of like Luma, Huva, that sort of thing. Another one was talking about Cypress testing. That is a good talk to listen to among many other things that they were talking about today. So definitely head over and check that out for some great front-end stuff that's mostly related to Magento.
Yes. And continuing the conference idea is Magento Association Connect is next month. No, it's actually this month. I think October 21st.
Months go by too fast.
Yeah, definitely. I somehow thought we were still in September. Although we are recording this on, the 11th day of October. So, yeah, that's
September
a problem.
was definitely last month.
I live in the future sometimes. I live in the past sometimes.
Some future you live in.
Yeah, no, it's kind of rough future. So I'll be actually speaking there, giving a talk about debugging. As I'm passionate about that. I'm wearing my debugging shirt. So super excited about that. In fact, one of our other team members is also talking there, Navarre. And so going to be some great talks. I'm super excited about that coming up. And so done with the conference talks, one thing to keep in mind is that PHP 7.3 is becoming end of life as of December. So if you haven't already, upgrade those Magento websites. Make sure that you get those 7.3 cleaned off. The servers, environments, however you're running it, upgrade to 7.4 because, you'll be out of PCI compliance here within 30 days after 7.3 goes end of life. And nobody wants that. It's just kind of a bit of a problem.
And so far for us, PHP 7.4 has been a pretty easy upgrade. Mm-hmm. So it should be because it's minor, but.
And we get the typed parameters. I can't remember too many other features that are available, but the typed parameters have sure been nice. As opposed to doc blocking it all.
I do think there's a couple others that are good on there, like the null safe operators, which is something I use in JavaScript. I'm not 100% whether that's PHP 8 or PHP 7.4, but those things are nice.
Yeah.
And all of those little things that are added in PHP are very nice. I'm more of a JavaScript guy personally, so I welcome the additions to PHP.
That's right, front end and back end. So, what can you say? But we get along well,
Most of the time.
Most of the time. Well, we could talk about that here in a second. But I think one other thing to note is that coming up the first Wednesday of next month, so this is truly next month, Jesse will be giving our eCommerce Ninja series of talks about PWA. So
you got too much back end in there, so we decided to go more towards the front end.
Yeah, I was getting a little bit weighty there, when I start talking about stuff too much. Although, hey, I did talk about GraphQL, and you could argue that is
nice.
front end, but I did
scoring points.
Yeah, but I guess you could say I talked about the back end, how to build out new GraphQL endpoints. So that was back end.
Okay, it's there for the front end.
That's right. That's right.
Yep.
So what we wanted to focus on today, and this will be a bit of a shorter conversation, is this idea of code reviews. And I know every company is going to do it differently. Perhaps some don't even do a code review, which is kind of a lousy deal. So we've worked through it, and we wanted to talk about a couple of things from our perspective. And certainly as you listen to this and you have thoughts, make sure to chime in on the comments. If you're listening to it on a podcast, it's a little harder, but just pop over to YouTube, SwiftOtter Inc. channel. Check out this podcast. We'll have code reviews in the title of it. And drop your comments there, or on LinkedIn or whatever you're seeing this. We love hearing that. So, Jesse, I guess we should maybe go back to the beginning is like, what is a code review?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the why and the what of that defines a whole lot of aspects of what should go into a code review. And I do think there's a couple different philosophies on there. Frankly, I'm not even for sure what your philosophy is on that. But like for me, I don't see the code review so much as like an aspect of QA, meaning I don't see that it is a part of making sure that it works like it should. I see it more like caring about the code as structure, the code style, security aspects, things like that, and kind of going into it with the assumption that the code works like it should.
That's right.
So what I see it adding is keeping the most important thing is quality.
That's right.
Kind of like out of the gate, let's make sure that all the code that we contribute to these repositories is quality. So when a developer, whether junior or mid-level or senior, opens a pull request, we want that to be good quality.
Yes, and I totally agree. And I think another point of that is a second pair of eyes. Now, again, the developer who is building this out they're probably or hopefully have debugged this and run through the debugger, so they're going to have a lot more context. But somebody else coming in with a second pair of eyes, they don't have all that context. And I had a code review this week that I pushed some code over to one of the members of our team, and they came back with some really good feedback. And I knew this person didn't have all the information that I did, but it made me think, well, maybe this information that I had kind of led me down the wrong road, and there was actually a better way to do it. And so it's actually in some ways kind of another way to pull myself out of this tunnel of thinking. Again, that's the whole art of e-commerce debugging. It's so easy to get into these tunnels, whether it's on a problem or maybe even we have the right problem, but even we might be tunneled into our solution to the problem, but even though there's kind of a parallel but better solution to this problem.
Totally. And that's the thing that I see junior developers having a lot of trouble with is tunnel vision. And so any opportunity to get kind of out of that and pull out of that is a good thing. And I think pull requests can be beneficial for just the project as a whole, but also the developer, because it's a good opportunity for me when I open a pull request, for instance, to go through and see the diff myself.
Yes, that is critical. Yes.
See, this is the code that I'm submitting, because I can get down there and do all sorts of changes through 10 files and forget about file number 9 and include it in the changes.
That's right. Or app.etc config.
Oh yeah.
We've made some pretty destructive changes there sometimes, and it's the code reviews where it's hopefully caught.
Yeah.
And we hopefully don't ever ship problems with that. But I think that's really important is just understanding that the person coming into this doesn't have all the answers. And thus, another aspect of, I think, a successful code review is documentation. Now, some people prefer to document the code. I guess I'm not that type of person as much. Maybe I should be, to be really frank. Throw it in the comments if I should be, I guess. But I think what we have more done as a team is we've more implemented our documentation in the actual code review itself. So it doesn't clutter up the code if this documentation is related more to an issue or a ticket or a problem or a feature request, that sort of thing. But it still explains kind of some of the thinking behind the code. And the nice thing is with Get annotations, it's super easy to go back, get the context, see exactly who wrote this, get the ticket number off of that, usually, and then it'll eventually all be linked together in that way. So in that way, it's kind of an extension of documentation in the code.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that pull requests allow is an opportunity to explain why a developer did something, or to discuss why a developer built it in a certain way. So when we started going to PHP User Group, you and I went there. And,
yeah, that was good memories.
There were some great people that went there, and one of the guys, I was building something, and he was like, "Hey," he's like, "I'll take a couple hours and just go through your application with you if you want." And so I took him up on the offer. We sat down in a coffee shop and went through it. And he asked me in a number of different places, he's like, so why'd you do it that way? And I was just like for me as kind of a junior developer, I was just like instant, like gears turning and like, oh, what do I say? I don't know. Like, it's just because it worked.
It's like when one of our children does something stupid. It's like, why'd you do that? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I've found out that sometimes that's actually a reasonable answer because it works is okay. Like, it's not necessarily bad. But for me at the time, it was like, whoa. But it kind of like opened a bit of a door in my thinking of just realizing like, it's a good thing. I should think about why am I doing it this way as opposed to some other way. And, because it works, okay, sure. If that's your reason, fine. But, maybe it's better to think about that a little bit.
That's right.
Think about like, why are you doing class preference, a class override as opposed to a plugin, right? Like, there should be a good reason.
Or an
for
around
that.
versus an after, right?
Exactly. For those, there should be a good reason. But still, it's a good opportunity to discuss the why.
That's, again, the value of the code review, and it done right, it can be really helpful. So I think we're kind of still talking about it from the author's perspective. And then I think we'll jump into, we have some notes about the reviewer's perspective. But still with this author, I think one other challenge is, what if I don't think, I think the advice is stupid? Like, what if I don't agree with it? And to be frank, that's one of the questions I often ask on an interview. And usually I get good feedback. Like, people are like, oh, yeah, I'd listen to the feedback and all that stuff. I only had one person said, well, basically, it'd be a jerk for telling me I did something wrong because I'm such a good developer. I was like, probably that's a no-go there. But all I'm saying is that how to handle those disagreements. Like, what if I don't agree with it? And that's where it comes down to a good perspective or important to have these open dialogues, to call somebody up. There's been a number of times that I've called the reviewer up and said, hey, I'm not exactly understanding what you want here. Maybe I don't even agree, and here's the reasons why I don't agree. Let's have a conversation about it.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Getting on the phone with somebody can really go a long ways compared to these these long threads. And I have nothing against the long threads. There's a place for that. And like, I have worked to move our team in the direction of asynchronous communication. And asynchronous communication is GitLab comments. So I'm not down talking them, but sometimes just getting on the phone is a really good thing to do.
It is a brilliant invention.
And one of the things that it does is it reminds you that the other person is a human. And I think one of the things that is important with these sorts of code reviews is just remembering this is a team member that's reviewing your code, meaning you are collaborating with them to help solve this problem. You're not fighting them try to achieve some like two different goals. I suppose there could be some cases where that happens, but at least not on our team. Here we work together, and I tell you, I have to give it a shameless plug for our team because like the folks that I work with, like my coworkers, they love the code reviews, and they are always like, we like it, and it's like good thoughts on that. I appreciate the constructive feedback and all of that, and so it's great perspective to have.
Oh, I totally agree. I could not be more proud of the team. The work Jesse's done. Like, it's just like, wow, it's phenomenal, and it's growing. It's like, wow, there's a lot on the plate. And it's so the synergy that one feels when you have a code review. It's like you learn something new out of this. Again, an example recently, somebody did a code review for mine, a guy that we just recently hired, super brilliant dude. And he's like, I didn't know about this. Like, so it's even in that way, it's probably one of the few things he didn't know about, to be really honest. But it's the type of thing that. It goes both directions. Like, as I am reading through, for example, reviewing your code, Jesse, or whatever, like, there's things I pick up. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Or I haven't used that in a while. Or that's a really interesting use case. So, well, I guess we are moving into the reviewers side of that. But quickly.
Yeah, we were talking about disagreements and how to handle that. And I think that one of the things, well, I speak more from the aspect of leading a team here. So it's a little bit of a mix from both standpoints. But one of the things is asking a question like, who's responsible for this? And I will defer sometimes, in my opinion, if the developer is going to be responsible for it, and then they push out something that I think there's a good chance is a mistake, but then they go and they're like, oh, recognize the mistake, and then come back. Like, there was a situation the other day where I was like, it was a kind of obvious mistake, and I was like, well, you need to change this, into where I actually kind of like, said something a little bit more firmly. But sometimes I will kind of have that flexibility. And I think that's one thing that can be helpful to remember. Sometimes is that, depending on what the type of thing is that we're discussing, it's important to be flexible with that from both directions, from both the reviewer and the author. Both, it's good to be flexible, and sometimes there isn't something that's like, this is the only right way to do things, and it's just kind of like,
there's a lot of times like that.
Yeah, there are. There's a lot of times. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's the conversation on the author side. Make sure you have really good information that you put in there. It's just hopefully associated with a work ticket, Jira ticket, whatever. There's those integrations to make sure that happens there. And this has been such a big thing for me. Honestly, it's stupid that I haven't done this my entire life. But make sure that every time, before you click that submit button on your merge request, review your code. Like, just review it.
Agree. Do it.
If you're writing JavaScript and you're like me and you insert a debugger statement in there, Jesse never does that. But like, if I was to do that, well, he's always going to flag that. Like, just go through your code and review it yourself. Like, okay, you're not going to review with the same eyes as your reviewer, but you're going to probably catch those really silly, stupid mistakes that nobody else really needs to see. It's easy to fix.
Absolutely. And just take a few minutes to write out a good description.
That's right.
Use bullet points, tell the reviewer what you did. But it's not just the reviewer. Remember that you might be looking back at this pull request in a month or 6 months to figure out what in the world the bug was that you introduced in that pull request at that time.
And why the heck you did it like that.
Exactly. So list out the reasons that you did the way that you did in bullet points. And if it's a 2-line pull request that fixes an obvious bug, okay, maybe then you don't. But most of the time, probably should.
Yeah, and it's okay to insert a little humor in there too.
Hey, that's a good idea.
Yeah, because hey,
break up the day a little bit.
That's right. Okay, so I think that covers from the author's perspective, and there's even more we can dig into. But let's talk about on the reviewer's perspective. And I think the first thing I want to point out there is two things. First, you don't always have all the facts. And second, your perspectives are not always the only way or the right way. And again, like we're talking about flexibility from the author's perspective, you as the reviewer have to understand that there is there's other ideas, other experiences that are coming into play here. Perhaps if it was something really obvious, code style can be nailed down, you have a document for that. But there should be flexibility, and if you think it works and the solution is good, perhaps you ping them, say, hey, maybe here's another idea, unless you just see it's flat out bad. And I think some of what we've been saying earlier is asking, what made you come to this conclusion? Like, can you elaborate a little bit more as far as why you did this? And then at the end of the day, there is going to be somebody in the hierarchy at your company who's going to have to rubber stamp it. It's going to have to, if you have that authority, it's like, okay, well, you put your foot down. Okay, this has to change. Like, there's something that just has to change. But I think most of the time, at least in our experience, I don't remember almost ever saying this just has to change.
It's not very often.
Very rarely.
And yeah, it's not very often. And it is so good to be kind of flexible with things as possible and to allow there to be some leniency. I also think about it from the systemic sort of thought process. So some of the things, for instance, if we're just talking about like strictly formatting, so there's no space between a parenthesis and a curly brace or something like that. If it's just one thing in a pull request, not a big deal. But if there's like 5 things in a pull request, I might bring it up and say, hey, do you have your linting enabled and working on your IDE, and see if we can help them.
That's good.
Get a systemic fix towards something like that, because I don't want to nitpick every single space, because that's a hassle for them. The other thing is that if there's one little formatting thing, but then a couple other problems with the thing, with the pull request, I don't have any trouble mentioning that formatting thing, even though it's a nitpick, because I know they're already going to be back in there, and it's going to take them 2 seconds to fix it. And it might help them to, recognize that sort of thing in the future. So generally, I try to steer away from some of those things, but still take them on as I feel like it's reasonable to do that.
Well, the other thing is, like, on the nitpicks, I like to call it out that it is a nitpick.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Just so that they know this is not like a huge deal. But the other thing is, you can always approve and merge the pull request and then ask them to come back later and fix it at some other time. Because it's not going to affect the performance of the application. It's just a visual thing, and it can be, I think especially for junior developers, it's more encouragement for them to get something out the door, as opposed to making sure every I is dotted exactly correctly.
Yep, that's a good point.
Let's talk about some of the things that we look for, and specifically that you'd written down as far as what is important in a code in a code review. Because ultimately, is it just making sure there's a space between the closing parenthesis and the opening squiggly brace? I mean, is that what we're doing, or there's more? So let's talk about some of that stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things that is part of this is to actually go through and think about every line of code. And that's really, really hard to do sometimes. When there's stuff going on and all of that, there's probably 10 things that I've got here on this list. And this just kind of like paints a little bit of a picture. It's hard to encapsulate everything, absolutely everything, but still line by line. And it's something I have trouble with, actually. It can get really easy to get lazy and just skim through the pull request, but every line, pay attention to it. I'm looking for things like security. So the other day, I remember you posting out on Slack this example of some code that you saw. And it was the classic thing where it's like really someone was doing a SQL query and they're doing, the column equals unescaped user input. And it's like, had they just inserted a question mark in there, comma, like 2 characters different, it would have been totally secure query. But without those 2 characters, it was totally unsecure query. That could have done some significant damage.
Yeah. And it was the prime opening. You drop tables. Well, actually, these were select. So you could literally select map columns. Yeah, it was really, really bad.
Real significant backdoor to the database. Yeah. And it didn't have to be like that. Like a good reviewer could have just said, hey, this needs to be fixed. And then the developer would have known that for down the road. And so they would have benefited from future pull requests. So security is one thing that I'm looking at in seeing, is this code, secure? Another thing is thinking about structure. How did the developer lay out the file, or the class, I should say, the method? Where did they put loops, and how did they build loops? For instance, there's a concept called cyclomatic complexity, where a method, it's kind of like how many routes of logic are there through a particular method. And if there's too many routes through the method, it becomes difficult to understand, difficult to read. Interestingly enough, it also becomes less self-documented. That's kind of a buzzword that's thrown around some, where you're supposed to write self-documenting code. But if your code has a high cyclomatic complexity, then it's probably not very well self-documented.
It's a huge code smell. Like if I get into a code, I think I've used this example before, and if you've heard it, forgive me, but electrical inspectors, like here in the United States, I don't know about, I'm sure other places in the world too, like you wire up a house, or like an electrician comes in, they always have to have a building inspector come sign off on the place. And I've definitely heard it said, electrical inspector goes and looks at the circuit breaker panel where all the power comes in and splits off to the rest of the house. And if they like what they see there, the inspection for the rest of the house goes so much easier. And it's the same way, like cyclomatic complexity, some of these like code hints, like code smells. Well, when I'm getting into a new project, it definitely raises my alerts for other problems that we start running into when I see stuff like that in there.
Yeah, and an easy way to think about cyclomatic complexity is how far indented your code gets.
That's right, yep.
That's overly simplistic. It's not actually just that.
Pretty close.
But it is. It ends up being practically, it ends up being basically that. So if you have your code indented 5 levels, probably too much.
That's right.
If it's 3 levels or less, you're probably okay. And I'm very intentional in using those words probably because there are exceptions. There's the old adage that says rules that are made to be broken. And so I try not to say like this is firmly a rule. And again, the indentation is a little bit of an oversimplification, but that is the easiest way that I have found to think about it and to just be able to recognize it outright. So structure is one of them. And just even thinking about the single responsibility concept. I did a code review not too long ago where there was some display-related logic in a React selector. So we're getting data together, and there was a little bit of display-related logic in there, and I was just like, hey, what about moving this to the component, so more of a display-related area, for instance, and I think the end result of that was much better. So those sorts of things, and again, those are very hard to kind of list out, and I think that's where someone that has more experience, somebody more of a senior developer might recognize more of those things than a junior developer, just practically.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you're planning to talk about this later, but variable names or naming. I don't know if that's because you've definitely on some of our reviews that we have done internally, Jesse's really good with variable names and calling stuff out that just doesn't make sense. And again, the whole idea of this buzzword of self-documenting code, if our variable names are bad, now the worst example is what I used to write quite a while ago, and that was where I started abbreviating variable names, which makes total sense at if it was ever to make total sense, it would make it at the time, but it doesn't even make sense then. But just making sure that if we can describe it to somebody else that's coming in fresh to whatever this problem is, then hopefully it does make sense. But if the variable names don't even make sense, then or class names, depending on how descriptive or colorful you're naming the classes, that's just going to be a recipe for disaster here in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Variable names are so important. Those naming things matter so much. And frankly, a lot of the times it just is a matter of taking a step back and thinking about it like, what should this be named?
That's right.
And that's usually the solution. I mean, every now and then I'll run into a situation where I spend 5 minutes thinking about what to name something. And that happens, and then that's still worth it. But most of the time it doesn't take that. So naming is absolutely a part of that.
Well, and to be really frank, naming is an area that I have not spent as much time on as I should. And I think it comes back to a bigger, grander problem that I can struggle with is the aspect of pretty much if I do a shoot from the hip decision, like as far as naming, I can probably get a 50 to 60% good. Like out of the grand scheme of things, it's going to be probably 50 to 60% of the way to being an excellent choice. I.e., sometimes it will be an excellent choice, and other times it'll be a really terrible choice. But that would probably average out. But as I force myself to take some extra time and to think about, okay, does this really make sense in the grand scheme of things? What name does make sense? That number goes from 50 to 60 to significantly more, and that's just a matter of taking the time for that.
Now, I'm not going to disagree with you. I probably shouldn't say this, but sometimes I do get the pull request from you, and I'm like, did he really think about the names there?
Yeah.
And then I'll just post a comment and boom, here will come back some great names. I'm like, way to do it.
Well, that's good. Like I'm very much on my growth journey as a developer, and this feedback is good.
I've also been impressed with the quantity of code that you can produce that works. So those things do go together.
Well, but usually there'd be like one dangerous bug in that quantity of code,
well,
and then it kind of nullifies any value that I did get out of that. But man, what can you say?
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Yep, that's a good point. Another thing is location. Where did the file go? And was this in a good module? That's particularly relevant in Magento. Did it go into a module that was named something that would apply to this sort of file? Did they put too much logic in a template? And that's kind of similar to like the structure conversation that we were just having, which would have some of those same things. Was this better in a block or a view model? Or is it okay to have several lines in a template that should maybe be moved somewhere else? Another one is naming. We just talked about that. Naming applies to absolutely everything. Like all code has to do, or practically all code that we write has to do with naming.
All
It's
code
such
in
a
general,
huge part
right?
of it.
I mean, that's PHP. Like that's
Well, I was just thinking there might be some compiled code that's not really like naming, right? Like, I don't know. Every now and then I see the
Webpack,
golfing
right?
Stack Exchange, and it's like, whoa, that's a little different. So
Yeah, that's true.
there's some things that don't really do that so much, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
naming code A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Oh.
You know, variable
Yeah.
names A, B.
Yeah, well, no, that's can't do that. No.
Yep. So naming is so important. Whether you're naming a CSS selector or whether you're naming a JavaScript variable or a PHP class, like it matters so much. And that's really, I think, the crux of self-documenting code.
That's right.
I think that's the very foundation of it, and where things build on from there.
Absolutely.
Another thing is title, the pull request title and description. We mentioned this earlier, but bullet points in the description or something that kind of describes process. I like bullet points just because they're easier to follow, but sometimes paragraph form is good too.
And the well, if I could say this, the bullet points are also helpful. There is occasionally the times for like an omnibus pull request, and so make the bullet points can help out there. Again, we keep that to a minimum because like. I see her smiling there. What we got going on?
Omnibus meaning one that fixes many bugs, and every now and then one of those rolls through. But you usually do a good job with it. You knock them out, and so hey, I can't argue with that.
It's not something that we want to do on a normal basis, but I think the biggest case that at least I run into that is I'm working on a bug. I come across another bug that was documented as well. So it's like, okay, well, I'm just gonna you can't really separate those out, and sometimes. I've had I've had a number of situations like that, and so it doesn't really make sense, in my opinion, to separate it out. You put it up, but at least it has to be very important, very well documented. The issue numbers in the title, et cetera, so that the tracking still happens.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't want to do it for like a week's worth of. And again, to be really clear, I'm not talking about a week's worth of work. That's
for sure.
Omnibus put together and just like 10 different tickets. Like that's really bad. But I think it happens for me. Like if I spend a couple hours on something and again find another bug, come back, it's all kind of part of the same process. In that case, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. We talk about it on our team. Like if you're working on one bug and you see another bug, like usually it's a good idea to fix it.
That's right.
So it is a good thing.
Well, and it comes back to something where we are constantly working at is just eyes open, because like you say, seeing another bug. So whether or not it's documented or not. If it's not documented, we have to write it up, unfortunately, but for us developers. But it's really important, and I think that's what provides better quality of service, is we're not just only working on this bug, we're actually working on fixing how this piece of the functionality relates to the rest of the system. And if we come across something else, I think it's our duty as a developer to step back, take the big picture, and get those problems solved. Whether you can solve it now, later, whatever your process is internally, it's important to make sure it will be solved eventually.
We're working on solutions, not writing code.
That's right.
Ultimately, we want a solution.
That's right.
A solution that will be something that solves the customer's problem.
Yes.
Code is just a vehicle to get there.
That's right. That's right. Maybe one time for one more thing, and then we'll bail here.
Yeah. So then another one is temporary code. Those debugger statements, console log statements that were just used for development.
No var dump, please. No var dump.
Yep. Pull those things out. Commented code. Oftentimes, it's like there's a get diff right there. There's oftentimes commenting code isn't necessarily beneficial. Right. There are times, but a lot of times it's better to just pull it. And especially when we're talking about like 5 lines of something, it's just like just pull it.
You can always in the ticket, you can always put a note back to the original commit that has this in there, so it's very well referenced. But at the end of the day, it's tempting to say, oh, I'm going to leave this in here because we're going to probably need it back. Most of the time, you don't ever need it back, and then it just ends up cluttering stuff up.
Yeah.
Now, to-do comments could be a little bit different.
Those are fine.
I find those are helpful, but actually just commenting straight up code, let's not do that. So anyways, I hope that you find that helpful. Talk about code reviews, some of the things that we've implemented, we've worked through, we are working through, as you heard some of these conversations here. Make sure that you provide what works for you, what doesn't work for you. We'd love to hear from that. We will personally learn from that And I hope that you have learned from some of the things we've talked about. The biggest thing is just don't get lazy with these code reviews. Work hard at them because your quality of your code will improve. Guaranteed. There's just no exceptions. Your code will improve. So thank you for listening. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic week. Look forward to more content from Smash the Bug from us, those of us here at SwiftOtter.